I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And I'm joined once again by San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala. And today, Liz, we're discussing a big court case from the recent past.
Yes, Chance, it's funny. We've been doing the docket now for almost a year, and that reminded me that there's quite a few cases that haven't been discussed that were pretty big. So periodically, I'd like to start revisiting some of them, for our listeners. So this week, I'm reminded that 2 years ago, a man was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison for the fatal stabbing of a San Antonio jogger as she ran at a park in the northwest side of San Antonio on New Year's Eve in 2013. This was the trial of Christian Bautista in the death of Lauren Bump. It's a memorable trial, not just because of how random or heinous it was, but because of the strange behavior that was exhibited by the defendant and now convicted killer, Bautista.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk more about that behavior here in a bit, but let's start with the details of the case.
Sure. Lauren Bump was 24 years old, and she was running alone on December 31st of 2013 in O.P. Schnabel Park, where she frequently went for a run on the wooded park's trails when she was stabbed to death. And San Antonio police said Bump's death was a random killing. And it sparked fear in San Antonio's running community for a long time afterward. Runners, joggers, and walkers were actually urged to take a partner with them when they were out on public trails when the story was all over the news. And within a week after her death, friends and supporters participated in a 1-mile silent run in her memory at the park where she was found. And this park is on the northwest side of San Antonio, off of Bandera Road. So her body was found at about 5:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve in 2013. And witnesses later would testify about a, quote, creepy man who sat on the trail for about 45 minutes where her body was found. And Lauren Bump was a graduate student at Harding University in Arkansas, and she was working on becoming a physician assistant. And, before she was killed, she had gone on a medical mission trip to Guatemala, the year before she died, and she had already bought a plane ticket to actually go back and do that.
So obviously a young woman who had a lot of things planned and her life was taken. And now we can say by the convicted killer because this is a case from a few years ago. Tell me more about Bautista.
Yes, Bautista was 29 years old when he was arrested and charged with Lauren Bump's murder on January 4th, 2014 was actually when he was arrested. And what we were able to find out about him is that he had been out of prison for about 2 months after he completed a full 6-year sentence for aggravated robbery in a case where he attacked a man with a crowbar. So prior to his robbery conviction, Bautista, whom people knew as Plex, had been arrested almost every year since he turned 19 in 2003. Most of those arrests were for drug-related charges, and he was jailed for 9 months on a criminal mischief case in Travis County. But in 2006, he was arrested on a charge of violating his bail terms on a drug possession charge. And he also had an immigration hold. He had been born in Mexico, but ICE said the agency had no jurisdiction over him, and they initially had no other comment about that. So officials at the time said that likely meant he was now a U.S. citizen at the time of the offense and the trial.
So now we've learned a little bit about the convicted murderer, the woman who was killed while out on a run, And tell me more about the trial. I mean, for what was told to the public as a random occurrence, a random murder, and as you talked about, that led to fear into the running and jogging community needing to bring someone with them when they go out. It seems that they caught this individual pretty quickly. How quickly did they go into trial?
Well, it started, the trial actually happened 2 years ago. So this was already a little bit of an older case, but, the testimony started in this trial on January 25th of 2016. And from the beginning, Bautista pretty much acted up in court. He grunted, mumbled, he stretched frequently, and he stared at several women in the courtroom, which prompted State District Judge Jefferson Moore in the 186th court to admonish him to stop causing distractions in the court. And at one point, he even stuck his tongue out at a witness when they identified him to the court. And the judge even threatened to have him removed from his own trial if he didn't behave. And I'll tell you, Chance, I was actually late one day getting to court, and the only seat that was left available in the courtroom, because a lot of people were going just to see proceedings in court, the last seat available to sit was actually right behind him. So I ended up sitting there, and pretty much at one point he turned around and was facing me and was staring me down. It was probably one of the most uncomfortable moments in court. And I was really, happy when Judge Moore called a break, because everybody got up and I immediately changed my seat because I had never experienced that before. So even Christian Bautista's attorney, Tim Molina, acknowledged in court that his client was creepy and exhibited strange behavior, but he noted that, it's not illegal to do those things. So, it was just a very strange situation.
And I know the strangeness, if you will, did not end there. That kind of continued on into the rest of the testimony.
Yes, it did. Kristen Bautista's roommate actually testified during the trial that lasted about a week that he had given Bautista a combat knife as a Christmas gift just a few days before Lauren Bump died. And he told the jury that he asked Bautista, what happened to the knife. And Bautista told him, I quote, "I stuck some bitch and I had to get rid of it." So this was testimony that came up in court. And, another thing that was very interesting is that the day that Lauren was running, there were several people in the park. And, again, it was New Year's Eve. And this was, he was probably in the park, probably from about maybe 3:30, 4 p.m. And I believe that Lauren Bump's body was found around 5:30. So there were a lot of people who remembered seeing him in the park, because he was dressed in all black. He, people were saying that there was this man who was acting weird and looking creepy, and trying to approach people also was something that one female witness said in court. But one of the people who saw him happened to be in the dental field, and she noticed his front teeth, which were chipped and broken. The witness was able to draw them for investigators. And when pictures of his teeth, his smile, and the drawing were shown in court, the similarities were really uncanny. So, I thought that was very interesting. I mean, how often can you actually? I mean, I've seen a lot of people in court where they will say one thing to police when they're doing an interview. Many times we see those videos in court, but when they come to testify, sometimes that testimony is a little different. What I remember from this is that this particular witness, said that that you could just tell that they knew some little nuances about how people's bites are and other things. And that was just something that really stood out to me. And not to mention the fact that when autopsy photos came up, it for a random crime, it was just really, really heinous what happened because Lauren Bump was pretty savagely stabbed. I think the count from the medical examiner who testified was that she was stabbed 27 times. And, she was a runner, and she was, was kind of a petite woman, at least from her photograph, but she was very fit. So she was probably on the smaller frame side. So, the just kind of like the overkill of the whole thing was just, very, very difficult for people in the court to, to look at and to really absorb, what had happened to her on New Year's Eve.
Elizabeth, you mentioned even that Bautista's lawyer during court proceedings had admitted, the odd, creepy, if you will, look of his client, but that was not illegal. What was the defense saying? What was Bautista saying? I assume because there was no plea deal, he said he didn't commit the crime. What was the defense trying to get the jury to believe?
Well, the defense was trying to get the jury to believe that because there was no murder weapon found, and that, he was not guilty. But there were things that came out. For instance, this particular park is near a Walmart, and prosecutors brought up video in the trial that actually showed someone looking like Bautista go into the store and buy clothes, right around the time that this crime was to have occurred. There were, dumpsters that were on the property at Walmart, and prosecutors said, obviously he had dumped his clothes there, and because these trash cans and dumpsters are cleared out pretty frequently, I mean, nobody's going to really go through there and find them. But the one thing that they were able to point out in court was that when he changed basically all of his clothes, and this was wintertime, so we're talking several layers of clothing, except a shirt and his underwear. So in reviewing some of the stories that I wrote at that time, I was reminded that his DNA and her DNA were both found on his shirt and on his underwear. So, it being winter and all those layers of clothing, how is someone else's blood and DNA going to get on, the undergarments of someone else? That was a notable thing that probably played into what, made the jurors decide that he was guilty.
And so, of course, that's the point that we've been making throughout today's episode, Elizabeth. This is a convicted murderer. Tell me about the verdict and the sentence.
Well, the trial, again, began on January 25th, and it ended on February 3rd with the Bexar County jury convicting him and sentencing him to life in prison. So Christian Bautista is now 34 years old and at the Polunsky unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And according to online offender information, he won't be eligible for parole until the year 2044, which would make him 60 years old. So, other factors that I remember from this particular trial, it's just coming to me right now, is that we pretty much spent a day looking at pictures of all of the MS-13 and Mexican Mafia tattoos that he had all over his body. In fact, I believe we even had a story that pretty much detailed all of those tattoos that he had. And all that really bizarre behavior that happened during the trial, a lot of people were thinking that, gosh, maybe, he's acting kind of weird. Maybe there's some sort of issue, maybe mentally or something that's going on with him. But, Chance, this was really an interesting thing that I observed and others did in court, I'm sure, was that the moment he was sentenced, that the jurors came back and said that they were sentencing him to life in prison, all of a sudden his demeanor really changed. And it was really kind of like a switch in a way. Suddenly he was really angry. And that all of the creepy, kind of crazy looks that he had in court and the different, behavior that he was exhibiting, all of that suddenly disappeared. And, I heard some people saying, in the gallery, wow, did you see his demeanor? And, I think at that point that people were just really wondering, gosh, was this the guy that was on the trail that day? Or was it the guy who was making faces and grunting and blowing kisses, as he was during trial? Because it was more than creepy. It was kind of scary in a way. So, and it was, you'd think that there would be a lot of ceremony. There really wasn't at the very end. He just really looked angry. Judge Moore sentenced him, wished him luck, and he turned around and walked away and back into the area where they keep the defendant. And that was the last time we saw him.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.